It's been 7 months since the horrific 7th October 2023 attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians. And now the Israeli army has just entered Rafah. It's another phase of their ongoing ground operations against Hamas in Gaza. But there are still questions about the October 7th attack, the lack of intelligence that led to a confused and disorganized response by the military and the police. So what went wrong? How could Israel's intelligence fail to ring the bell? How did Mossad fail? Joining me to discuss this is Prem Mahadevan, researcher in intelligence studies and author of Spies Among the Sands. Prem, welcome to the News9 Plus show.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Prem, I must say that it's an astonishing work that you put together on the Mossad. It's rare for Indian researchers to research foreign intelligence agencies, and you've done that with aplomb. 7 decades, a sweep from 1947 right to present day. How long did it take you to write this book on Mossad?
It took me the better part of 2.5 years.
Right. Prem, now I must start by asking you about the a topic that you've raised in the book, of course, and which is on everyone else's mind. The 7th October attack. Mossad is believed to have near supernatural powers. If you look at it, the kind of hype around the agency. How did an agency like Mossad fail to detect the 7th October attacks?
Well, I would begin by pointing out what some Mossad, ex-Mossad officers who are now at liberty to comment to the media have pointed out, that this is not really a Mossad failure necessarily. It is more likely to be a failure of the Israeli military intelligence and of the domestic security service, the Shabak or Shin Bet, as it's called. So Mossad might claim later on, when the inquiry is held and the post-mortem is done, that it focused on tracking Hamas's funds, its transnational flows and the decisions made by Hamas leaders who were based in Qatar and elsewhere in the world. So it might say that, look, this didn't really fall within our jurisdiction, therefore the bulk of the responsibility for the failure lies with Aman, that is the military intelligence service, or with Shabak or Shin Bet. So I would start with that initial caveat first.
Right. And interesting, Prem, this is exactly the kind of debate that we had in India just 25 years ago, just after the Kargil war. This inter-intelligence agency, fight, who was responsible for detecting those intrusions. But that's a subject for another day. But how would you classify this 7th October failure, Prem? Pulling back from just Mossad and looking at this entire Israeli intelligence apparatus, there are it's like an alphabet soup of agencies. You have Shabak, you have Shin Bet, you have Mossad, you have the Unit 8200, one of the most formidable Israeli intelligence organizations. So a lot of these agencies claim to have already had the plans for this beforehand, which leads one to ask the question, was this an intelligence failure or was this a policy failure? The failure to appreciate the intelligence that was given to you?
I would say that in certain cases it becomes very difficult to separate the two, because when you have something of this magnitude, everyone's going to blame the other side. Now, I would point out something. I mean, historically, if you look at it, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 is considered an intelligence failure. But we do know that actually there was intelligence provided in advance. And as my book says, the Israelis made a conscious decision that they could absorb the first blow. So that has come out now, and it's not really a matter of dispute. So on the one hand, there was a lack of warning, but it wasn't that they were completely caught off guard in 1973. Now, in the case of 7th October, I think what we're going to see is, first, there was a huge element of wishful thinking, which clouded the Israeli threat perception. And that wishful thinking came down to the idea that for a while, ever since 2018, Israel had been cooperating with the Qataris to send funds to Hamas. So that was a policy of a so-called buying peace or buying quiet. Not so much peace, actually, just quiet, keeping Hamas dormant, by giving them some money which they could use to govern Gaza. And I think when one is committed to a policy like that, one starts to miss out some of the warning signs. Now, we do know there have been reports in the New York Times and so on that Unit 8200, the Signals Intelligence Unit of Israeli military intelligence, did pick up signs that there were preparations for an attack. We also do know that the Israelis came into possession of a detailed Hamas war plan, which was very similar, more or less identical to what unfolded on the 7th of October. But the key is, was that plan collected as a result of routine collection activity, or was it a result of very targeted and focused collection? And the impression one gets is that this was routine collection. They, as a part of their normal coverage of that group, found out that this is what Hamas aspired to do, and they assumed, we do know from whatever sources, whatever leaks have come out, that the Israelis assumed Hamas's war plan was purely aspirational, that their capabilities were not quite there in terms of carrying out such an ambitious attack.
Right.
So Israel depended very heavily on the idea that it could buy off Hamas to stay quiet, and that it had very good physical security measures which could thwart a smaller attack, a smaller offensive. The scale of what happened on 7th October was huge, and that overwhelmed the Israeli defense.
Absolutely. And in fact, Prem, when you were speaking, I was just reminded of those lines from your book, the scenario that you built up after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when the Amman, the military intelligence, estimated that Egypt would not strike until they had got all the deliveries of their new fighter aircraft and their Scud missiles from the Russians, the Soviet Union, of course. And they would, this kind of an attack wouldn't happen until 1976. So there are eerie parallels between 2023 and 1973 in your book, as you've brought out. But, you know, what will Mossad look like, Prem? Tell us what it will look like after this war is over. And surely it shows no sign of it ending. But once it does, how will the Israelis overhaul their intelligence architecture, and what kind of role do you see Mossad playing in that new architecture?
So I think what we are going to see is that the Mossad will have to do a very fine balancing act. Now, they'll be experts at this. I don't think it'll be a problem for them, but they'll have to do a balancing act between carrying out covert operations in countries with capable security services and yet building up an international counterterrorism coalition that will be targeted at Iran. So here's the thing. There's going to be some tension with, for example, Qatar and Turkey going forward. Right. It has been reported that Israel had to give the Qataris an assurance that it would not assassinate Hamas leaders on Qatari soil. And in return, the Qataris agreed to facilitate the return of Israeli hostages who are now being held by Hamas. Now that promise, if it was given, and there's no, we don't know for sure it was, but if it was given, that promise will have a shelf life. At some point, the Israelis are likely to go after Hamas leaders wherever they are, including Qatar and also Turkey. Now, we do know from media reports that the Turkish intelligence service, MIT, has been very active in disrupting Israeli espionage and intelligence collection efforts against both Iran and against Palestinian militant groups on Turkish soil. So I would imagine that Israel will have to, the Mossad specifically, will have to refine its tradecraft, that if it wants to target terrorist leaders who are based in countries where Israel has not normally carried out paramilitary operations, it would have to do this and yet not get caught by fairly competent local security services. We must remember what happened in Dubai in 2010, when the Israelis assassinated a Hamas financial official, and they got away with it. Or, I mean, it's believed the Israelis carried out the assassination. Let's be very exact here. It's thought that the Mossad was involved. And the photographs and the cover identities of these alleged assassins was put out over the international media. Now, that operation was not really a failure, but it did lead to the exposure of the actual team which carried out the attack or the assassination. So if the Mossad wants to carry out more operations in countries where there are strong surveillance technologies,
Right.
it will have to improve its tradecraft. But on the other hand, it will also have to rely on international intelligence partners to warn of terrorist attacks carried out by, for example, Hezbollah, which has quite a strong international reach.
Right.
So that balancing act will have to be done.
The balancing act will have to be done indeed, and Mossad seems to be the agency just to do the right thing, because as your book brings out, they're pretty adept. They land on their feet after every crisis. And here's my next question. Prem, what do you see as Mossad's biggest achievement, and what has been their biggest failure since 1947?
I would divide that into two levels, the operational and the strategic. So if you look at operational successes, I think the Mossad has no shortage of them. So we can start with, for example, the killing of Imad Mughniyeh, the Hezbollah operations chief in Damascus in 2008. Now that operation is believed to have been carried out with the support of CIA. So it's not exclusively an Israeli success. But then one could argue that the killing of Ali Hassan Salameh in Beirut in 1979, that was an even bigger success, because that cut the communication link between the PLO and the CIA. And that ensured that Israel had about a decade or so before the Americans then started to again deal with the PLO at a high level. So that was a success as well. Then you could, on the failure side, you could look at, for example, the killing of an innocent civilian in Lillehammer in 1973. Now that was a failure. Or the attempted assassination of Khalid Mashal in Jordan in 1997. That was a failure. But these are operational failures.
Right.
At a more strategic level, I think Israel's or the Mossad's greatest success was probably supporting the Yemen or involvement, its covert involvement in the Yemeni civil war in the 1960s, because that tied down a third of the Egyptian army in Yemen and made sure that Nasser, the president of Egypt, could not really threaten Israel, although he was prone to blustering and saying that he would fight Israel. He really didn't have the capacity to. So the fact that Israel was able to keep a third of his army tied down for a long period of time, that really contributed to Israel's spectacular victory in the 1967 war, which was probably its finest hour. So I would say there, and you also see that decade, the 1960s, as probably being Mossad's golden era.
Right.
In terms of the audacity of its operations and its successes. I mean, when I was researching for this book, one thing that struck me is that a lot of the great stories that are associated with this agency are pretty much in the past. And this is not to say that they don't have spectacular successes ongoing now, which we may hear of in some decades to come. But, if you really look at what people focus on, it's always something like Entebbe or something dating back to the 1960s.
Right.
If you go more recently, you start to look at, say, a big failure was the Lebanon War of 1982. From what we know, the Mossad in particular really had quite poor coverage of Lebanon. And that may have been one reason why, for example, Israel was caught off guard by the sudden rise of Hezbollah and the power of that group in the early 1980s.
Right, absolutely. And Prem, before I go, my last question to you is, your book brings out this 4 factors that are responsible for Mossad's success. And one, of course, is being the Israeli diaspora, a great source of support overseas for the intelligence agency. But it also talks of this culture of militarized risk-taking that exists in the political setup, Israel's political setup. I mean, of course, because of the fact that a lot of their leaders are military men who've been served in the IDF and who've indeed headed Mossad as well. Can intelligence agencies, successful intelligence agencies, be insulated from the character of the governments that they work for?
I think that really, that the question actually comes down to what exactly is the nature of the country. There are intelligence agencies which do little more than run, than conventional espionage,
Right.
gathering open source literature, grey literature, collecting palace gossip, and basically then commercial or economic intelligence. And that might be all they are required to do, and they can be quite successful at that. When you look at geopolitical contestation, on the other hand, and you look at the Cold War, US versus the Soviet Union, or anything that is really on a bigger scale, there you start to have questions of long-term security and strategic policy coming in. And once a policy has been introduced, then the intelligence agencies have to work within the framework of that policy. So to put it very bluntly, I mean, coming back to October 7th, if there is a script that we are going to essentially marginalize this issue, the Hamas issue, the whole issue of Palestinian nationalism, that becomes very much part of the informal security doctrine of a country, right? Then intelligence agencies have to work according to the assumption that unless they can openly or unless they can detect very clear and unambiguous signs of an attack, they still have to anticipate smaller level events. It cannot be something massive because that completely overturns the security paradigm. The Israelis work according to what are called conceptions or concepts, right? And that's essentially a paradigm for how to interpret the current security situation. That will always be there with a country which faces multiple threats and needs to conceptualize and frame ways of thinking about such threats.
Right. Thanks very much, Prem. That's a very, very detailed take on Mossad. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's rare for an Indian researcher, counter-terrorism researcher, to look closely at a foreign intelligence agency, and you seem to have done that with Spies Among the Sands, and we'll keep coming back to you for updates on Israel and Israel's national security, especially when it comes to agencies like Mossad. But thanks very much for joining us this evening on the News9 Plus show.
Streaming on News9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.